Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Imagine a high-stakes geopolitical chess match, just unfolding incredibly quickly, right before our eyes.
It certainly feels that way. Things are moving fast.
Yeah, so today we're doing a deep dive into these, well, frankly, surprising developments around a potential meeting between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin.
And not just the meeting itself, but what's happening in the conflict and maybe some deeper shifts in international politics, too.
Exactly. So what's our goal here? What are we trying to figure out?
I think we need to unpack these events, try to understand the motivations, the strategies of the main players,
Right.
and see what it all means for the global stage, really.
Okay, let's start with the speed. U.S. President Trump's ultimatum to Russian President Putin, 50 days, suddenly down to just 10. That's startling.
It is, and what that speed strongly suggests is intense secret negotiations were already happening.
Behind the scenes.
Exactly. It points to the meeting maybe being agreed upon before the public ultimatum was even made.
So the ultimatum was more of a public move, seizing the initiative.
Seems like it. U.S. President Trump making it public to control the narrative, perhaps. We also heard, that Jerusalem was initially floated as a location.
Interesting. Why Alaska then?
Well, Alaska feels more like neutral ground, doesn't it? Far away from Europe, emphasizes this direct U.S.-Russia channel.
Okay, so why now? What's the real trigger for the U.S. and maybe Europe too, genuinely pushing to end the conflict at this moment?
I think the simplest, maybe the most significant reason is that Russian President Putin is perceived to be making gains.
Winning, essentially.
Winning, yes. And these gains, month by month, look increasingly irreversible. He's consolidating control in Donbass.
And Donbass is key. Why is it so critical beyond the territory itself?
Well, take the water situation in Donetsk, for example. There was this channel, the Severodonetsk-Donbass channel, built back in the 50s or 60s.
I remember hearing about that.
It supplied water even after 2014. But now it's been destroyed.
So without controlling more territory.
Exactly. If Russian President Putin doesn't secure places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, Donbass essentially faces a massive water crisis. That makes stopping hostilities very, very difficult without securing those areas first.
Okay, that adds a layer of grim reality.
Yeah.
Now, where does President Zelenskyy fit into all this? His position seems to be shifting, or at least the perception of it.
There's definitely been a noticeable shift. You remember his earlier statements? Very strong, Ukrainians won't give up land.
Yes, back in April 2022, that sentiment was strong, tied to the U.S. goal, then, of preventing future Russian actions.
Right, but now you see Western publications suddenly highlighting corruption concerns in Ukraine.
Particularly around President Zelenskyy's moves with NABU and SAP, the anti-corruption bodies.
Precisely. And that seems to have shifted the narrative a bit. That whole nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine idea.
It's evolving.
It seems to be morphing into something more like, let Ukraine sort out its own internal issues.
So when President Zelenskyy says now he won't concede land, who's he really talking to?
The understanding is that's directed less at Russian President Putin and more towards U.S. President Trump.
And U.S. President Trump's response is essentially
pretty clear from reports.
Yeah.
Fine, you want to keep fighting, go ahead. But not with American money.
A return to realism, perhaps. A harder edge.
It certainly reflects a step in that direction, yes. A more transactional approach to international politics.
Now, there were earlier proposals, weren't there? Did Russian President Putin miss a big chance by turning down U.S. President Trump's previous offers?
That was the narrative for a while. He rejected proposals involving the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant transfer to the U.S. and returning the Kimburn spit.
Strategic points, both of them.
Very strategic. And yes, many observers said he missed his chance.
But
now, word is that the new proposals, the ones Ambassador Witkoff supposedly brought, are actually significantly better for Moscow than the old ones.
But though he didn't miss out after all. Maybe waiting paid off.
It looks that way. And since those earlier offers, remember, Russian forces have taken more ground that coal mine near Pokrovsk, the lithography deposit in Shevchenko.
Their leverage increased.
It seems so.
How did President Zelenskyy react, even just to the idea of a deal being discussed, before any details were out?
He wrote something quite stark, didn't he? That it was time to end the war, but acknowledging it would end on worse terms for Ukraine territorially than back in April 2022.
Plus the immense human cost and destruction since then.
Exactly. Which raises that difficult question. why didn't it end in April 2022?
When some apparently pursued unrealistic goals, like the 1991 borders or even dismantling Russia, things the U.S. never actually promised.
It seems that way. And there was this idea presented to President Zelenskyy that continuing the fight would make him a leader of the free world, like Churchill.
Powerful image.
Yeri. And as Sun Tzu warned, sometimes a ruler might, sacrifice their own country for personal glory. A harsh assessment, but it's out there.
Okay, let's circle back to Alaska. What does that location choice really tell us?
It's quite symbolic, I think. It really underlines that Europe, and Ukraine for that matter, are largely on the sidelines of this specific negotiation.
This is Trump-Putin direct.
Pretty much. Just the two main powers trying to hash things out. And that, in itself, addresses a problem that's dogged this conflict.
Which is?
The lack of a clear negotiating subject, partly because of the, let's call it, soft power approach of previous U.S. administrations.
Like when Russian President Putin wanted to meet U.S. President Biden before the war.
Yes, and was told, essentially, talk to Ukraine, it's their issue. That nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine mantra, while sounding principled, effectively blocked direct top-level talks.
It created a situation where maybe unrealistic demands could stall serious discussion.
You could see it that way. We also saw how European leaders kind of stalled things before. Remember U.S. President Trump's move offering weapons, but only if Europe paid.
Right, that caused a stir. Some key European leaders who'd made those trips to Kyiv suddenly got very quiet.
Exactly. They might still meet Ukrainian officials before any potential Alaska summit, but U.S. President Trump's maneuver kind of outflanked them.
What was Europe's game there, do you think?
Perhaps hoping U.S. President Trump would keep paying while they criticized him. Or, if things went badly, blame him for losing the war.
And this move blocked both possibilities.
It seems to have neutralized that, yes.
This all seems to point towards a bigger theme you touched on earlier, this decline of realism in international politics since the Cold War ended.
Yes, after 1991, there was a definite shift, especially in parts of the U.S. leadership, a move away from pure pragmatism towards a more idealistic approach.
Believing policy could be based on just doing what's right.
Sort of, intervening in Yugoslavia or Iraq based on ideals. And look, the situation in Iraq now, people there are arguably worse off than under Saddam Hussein.
That's a start point.
It's quite an achievement for idealism, really, because it's hard to make life worse than under Saddam. Even old-school colonizers would usually ensure some stability for resource extraction. But idealists with noble goals sometimes pave the road to unintended places.
And this idealism, you argue, can lead to chaos, like helping the weak without asking why they became weak.
Well, consider the Israel-Gaza situation through that lens. Helping Gaza from a purely idealistic view could be seen as inadvertently strengthening Hamas, making their strategy of using civilians more effective, perhaps. It's complex.
So the nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine approach, without concrete power behind it.
It led to a situation where Ukraine and Russia were grinding each other down for years. A realpolitik approach arguably might have prevented the war altogether.
And this high moral ground, declaring aggressors war criminals.
It sounds good, but it can make dealing with messy realities almost impossible. Everyone starts demanding a perfect idealistic solution that just doesn't exist on the ground.
So, if U.S. President Trump is trying to bring back realism, what leverage does he actually have? What tools?
Well, he's effectively taken the U.S. out financially, saying no more blank checks, but actual levers to force Russian President Putin into a peace he doesn't want, they seem limited.
The tariffs against India and China, for instance.
They haven't really worked as intended so far, have they? Indian Prime Minister Modi pretty openly pushed back on them, and then he had that long call with Russian President Putin right after.
Right, and while reviving U.S. industry is a goal.
U.S. President Trump faces domestic constraints, doesn't he? High living standards, strong unions, things he can't just sweep aside if he wants to get reelected. It's a very tough balancing act.
Plus, that friction with India, U.S. President Trump claiming credit for mediating with Pakistan?
Yes, Prime Minister Modi reportedly wasn't happy about that, or about the U.S. appearing too close to Pakistan. Adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so what are his actual cards then? What can he realistically play?
Well, the big one is no weapons for Ukraine unless Europe pays. And based on past performance, Europe offers mostly words, not cash, at that scale.
And the tariffs?
They're his main economic stick against Russia's partners, like China and India. But they're either not working well enough or using them more aggressively risks huge blowback, maybe even speeding up de-dollarization.
So the conflict meant perhaps to weaken Russia and Ukraine.
Has actually ended up weakening the West, especially Europe, and exposing limits to U.S. power. It's clear the U.S. can't just cripple Russia with sanctions anymore. Europe's almost being taken out of the geopolitical equation in some ways.
And meanwhile, this new grouping, China, Russia, India.
It's emerged as a really significant force, not just, rogue states, but a serious geopolitical bloc. The global economy is just too big now to completely isolate a country like Russia.
And U.S. President Trump's actions, maybe sometimes clumsy,
have inadvertently pushed these powers closer together, perhaps, creating a potential alliance with, pretty challenging prospects for the EU and the U.S.
Given all that, why on earth would Russian President Putin agree to peace terms now? It sounds like he holds a lot of the cards.
He doesn't seem to have much incentive to compromise right now, does he? The military situation appears to favor him.
We heard reports, like that unit in Chasiv Yar.
Reportedly fleeing, yes, and not the first time. It suggests Ukrainian units are exhausted, gaps are appearing. This is happening before they even run out of the main U.S. supplies.
Well, the U.S. says Europe pays first, and European supplies could take years.
Exactly. So the momentum seems to be with Russia. But look, there have been several attempts now at U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin finding some understanding.
So they'll get there eventually.
It feels like they're probing, feeling each other out, signaling they're open to real negotiations, not just posturing.
And Russian President Putin's bottom line in these real negotiations?
His real non-negotiable condition. It's almost certainly securing those 4 regions plus Crimea. That seems fixed.
So U.S. President Trump really only has 2 paths?
Essentially. Either somehow persuade President Zelenskyy to cede that territory, which looks almost impossible politically, or let Russian President Putin take it by force and then negotiate from that new reality.
And the risk of wider war, World War III.
It feels less likely now than it did under some previous policies. The conflict seems largely contained geographically for now. The most probable path feels like waiting.
Waiting for more Ukrainian territory to fall.
Unfortunately, yes, waiting until Russian President Putin has secured those 4 regions and Crimea, by which time he'll likely have pushed further, maybe into Sumy, Kharkiv.
Leading to new demands, like Medinsky hinted at.
Exactly. The goalposts will likely have moved again by then.
We've certainly navigated a complex web today. Motivations, strategies, these big shifts. From Lassig back to the fundamentals of realism versus idealism. It's clear there are no simple answers here.
No, there aren't. And this deep dive really shows how decisions made years, even decades ago, are still shaping what's happening right now. It highlights how important it is to grasp the practical consequences of even the grandest ideals.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.